Good morning, noon, or night, wherever and whenever you are listening to The Shift. I am your host, Doug McKenty. This is episode 43 of The Shift, being recorded on June 26, 2020. My guest on the show today is Mark Jeftovic, author of the new book Unassailable and CEO of easyDNS Technologies, a domain registration and website hosting company. Mark also writes for the blog Out of the Cave, formerly known as Guerrilla Capitalism, where you can find many essays concerning culture, economics, politics, as well as technology from a libertarian perspective. I first ran into him when one of his articles was posted by Zero Hedge entitled On Toxic Virtue and the New Digital Samizdat. Samizdat refers to an underground distribution network of state-censored manuscripts in Eastern Europe before the end of the Cold War. What piqued my interest initially was his description of virtue mongering and the historical comparison between what seems to be happening now with the early days of the French Revolution, referred to as the Terror, when those suspected of lacking fraternity with the revolutionaries were quickly dispatched to the guillotine. Over the past decade, we have witnessed a barrage of digital attacks by large platforms that once promised they would adhere to the sanctity of free speech, yet bit by bit have chipped away at those who would dare speak out against the mainstream. We have seen multiple attacks on alternative views by Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube using algorithms that bury alternative content. Sometimes these platforms go so far as to demonetize or entirely deplatform altogether those content providers whose opinions don't conform to the dominant corporate or state-sponsored narratives considered the truth by the powers that be. This form of corporate censorship often hides behind the veneer of virtue, but has the ultimate effect of stifling a collective conversation about just what virtuous action is. Alternative perspectives are simply censored and branded as fake news rather than integrated into the collective consciousness through dialogue and free association. Are we witnessing the early days of a new terror? The effect of what is now being called cancel culture is chilling. Many are self-censoring, knowing that the political and economic repercussions of defying the mainstream could have powerful negative effects on personal reputation and even the ability to earn a living. Mark's latest book, Unassailable, goes into detail about how to avoid dependence on third-party digital platforms that engage in this modern version of book burning. In it, he describes how to use social media platforms to lead potential customers back to your own website, where they are free to associate without concern for the whims of big tech. Mark methodically shows how to monetize and distribute content from a secure domain by building a community organized from within, while preventing large social media platforms from controlling distribution and income streams. He outlines the process of a new digital samizdat that produces and distributes alternative content away from interference by corporate and government forces outside the control of the content creator. This is a must-read for any who are interested in participating in a free market of ideas. Find out more about Mark's work at www.outofthecave.io. You can also find out more about The Shift at www.theshiftnow.com or check out The Shift with Doug McKenty on Facebook, at dmckenty on Twitter. I would like to welcome Mark Jeftovic to the program and thank you for helping to make The Shift. Enjoy the show. Hey, Mark, how's it going today? Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Doug. Good to be here.
Yeah, sure. I really enjoyed the book, Unassailable. I hope my listeners think about checking it out. It offers a lot of real viable solutions. But I wanted to, well, first of all, why don't you just, in your own words, give your history and tell us a little bit about the Out of the Cave blog and why you wanted to write a book like Unassailable.
Sure. Well, history, I've been in the internet business since the mid-90s. I started working at one of the first dial-up ISPs in the Toronto area, a place called inforamp.net. And it was one of those industries in those days you could still walk in off the street, get a job in an ISP, the way you used to be able to do the same in the recording in the recording industry a couple decades earlier. And that's actually the business I came out of. I went to college for music industry arts and wanted to be a record producer and all that sort of stuff, and played in metal and punk bands for most of my life. But then I kind of got swept along into this internet thing in the mid 90s. It came along and I just knew it was a game changer. I had gotten a job at the United Church of Canada head office, and it was, porting COBOL code from this mainframe computer they had to this SCO 486 running Tandy Xenix. And the guy I replaced had left to start Toronto's first ISP, a place called Internex Online. And then as I started learning more about this internet thing that was coming, I just became more enamored with it. And I realized this, I didn't know how, and I didn't know how I was going to be involved. I just knew this was going to be big and I wanted to be involved. And so, I managed to get a job at one of the early ISPs. And then from there, we created, with a couple of partners, I created a custom web design place. We were one of the first places that was doing dynamically generated web pages with MySQL backends.
Uh-huh.
And then around the late 90s, we started a company called easyDNS. And easyDNS started off as a DNS provider because Network Solutions had a monopoly on registering domain names. And we were just saying, imagine if you could control your own domain from your own web browser instead of having to talk to your ISP or your tech guy or something like that, because long story short, there was always problems with that. So we started that business in 98. And then around 2004, 2005, I bought out my partners, and I've been running easyDNS ever since. But the thing I've noticed over the years is that how I used to say it in the late 90s was, why are all the crazies attracted to domain policy? I was on a couple of domain policy mailing lists. Network Solutions ran one. There was the early ICANN list, and it was full of nut jobs. Sorry
Right.
to anyone who might be listening. I was one of the nut jobs. Okay, we were all nut jobs. But the thing that I realized was that all of the nuts converged on naming, because naming was going to be the cornerstone of your digital identity going forward. And that's why all of these ideological battles were being fought on the naming front. So then as time went on, it became more apparent to me that in order to have full agency in this new digital world, you had to have complete control over your own naming infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always been the sort of core ethos of easyDNS ever since. I mean, our mantra has always been, we kill lock-in in all its forms. So whenever a large telecom, in the old days, the telecoms used to block port 25, so you couldn't run a mail server on your own, cable modem connection,
Right.
which is, we thought, kind of ridiculous, because if you're paying for the connection, what do you care if the guy is binging on Netflix or sending his own email in and out of his network, as long as he's not spamming? So we would create a system where we could port forward around a telco's blocks on port 25. And that was the kind of thing that we always started making a habit of doing. Later on, now we've got the big tech social media platforms. You've got Facebook, and you've got Twitter, and you've got YouTube and Google, and they're the ones who are throwing up all of these lock-ins that we are still trying to help you root around the lock-in. And
And
so a book,
what
sorry,
just
go
for
ahead.
my audience, what is the definition of a lock-in? What are you describing when you say that term?
Lock-in is Hotel California. You can check in anytime you want, but you can never leave, right? So it's a take it or leave it set of rules.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even have to try to be equitable to you. We're just going to set this set of rules. We're going to enforce them arbitrarily, probably not even in a coherent manner across the
Right.
spectrum, and you just have to deal with it.
And
And
this
then
would
we're going to
be,
make it, go ahead.
well, this would be in like managing your domain name, or then in the terms of the social media sites, your actual content, if you're posting
Yeah.
content. Yeah.
And your followers. I mean, the
Right.
thing I say in the book is, you have 2 million Twitter followers. They're not your followers. They're Twitter's users that Twitter allows you to access, as long as you play by Twitter's rules.
Sure.
So, I mean, that's always been our ethos, is rooting around lock-in, getting you out of lock-in, making you as free as possible to do what you want with your online identity. And then the whole out of the cave thing, I mean, along the way, I just got interested, I guess, after the dot-com crash. I realized how little I knew about finance and economics. And so
Mm-hmm.
I just started making it my business to learn as much as I could about it. And I realized that every time I I had to keep taking a step back to a bigger picture. Like I first started looking at why do stock markets crash? And then I had to look at, well, what makes companies economically viable? And I had to keep backing up a step until I got to the point where I was asking, what is money at the end of that? And so
Right.
that's what got me into the whole concept of Austrian school economics. And
Right.
that's, then suddenly you're a libertarian at the end of all that. And, and there were things like in 2003, there were digital gold currencies. They were kind of precursors to the cryptocurrencies like e-gold and gold money, which is still around today, and PC Unix or Unix or however it was pronounced, and things like that. And we were one of the early adapters of that. We were the only registrar that was taking e-gold as a payment form in those days.
Uh-huh.
So they always kind of, digital freedom and economic freedom sort of became, enmeshed in my mind. And that's when I started blogging separately about it. The blogs had many different incarnations over the years. Wealth.net a long time ago, rebooting capitalism, guerrilla capitalism. Now it's out of the cave. I think I finally have a name I can stick with.
Right. Do you want to talk about why you changed the name to Out of the Cave?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've been trying to come up with a word for the past few months. It's this concept of, if you have ever read Flatland, what was the guy's name? It was like, I have the book around here somewhere. It was a parable. It was a tale of a two-dimensional story where this square living in two dimensions encounters a being from a third dimension who tells him there's a whole third dimension out there that none of you flatlanders can see. And he starts preaching about the third dimension to the people of Flatland, and they put him in prison, and the penalty for preaching about the third dimension is you get beheaded. And so I was trying to come up with a word for, how would you describe being, achieving a perception of events from an extra dimensional axis than what we have. And I couldn't find a single word to describe that. But the closest metaphor that could sum it up was Plato's cave analogy.
Right.
And if you know Plato's cave analogy, do you want me to go through it really quickly?
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's the idea that Plato made an analogy, a philosophical analogy, that imagine some men sitting in a cave and they're chained in place so they can't turn around, and behind them there's a light, and the light is projecting shadows onto the cave wall, and the men looking at the shadows on the cave wall think that's reality, and they have no clue that there's an entire real world behind them out of the cave, where reality is just a projection of onto this wall. And the more I thought about that analogy, I thought that's actually the process of getting unchained and coming out of the cave, the way Plato described it in his analogy. That's actually moving from two dimensions into the three-dimensional world, because when they're seeing the caves on the wall, that's a two-dimensional aspect. And so when you become unchained and you come out into the world and you blink your eyes in the sunlight, you can see everything. You're now apprehending things in three dimensions. And I thought, this is as close as I'm going to get to a word that describes that process. And so I went with Out of the Cave.
Well, it is interesting. Your story reminds me of my story, except that I actually studied, political philosophy and economics in school, and still knew nothing about how currency was made, and had to go through the same process, post graduation, in order to figure all of this stuff out, because they really do hide it. I mean, they keep it in the cave. They don't let you see what's out there, unless you're willing to explore these ideas on your own. And then you're lucky if, like in Flatland, if you're not persecuted for exposing that third dimension. It's crazy that the information is clearly out there, but then, it's difficult to find. And when you are finding it, or God forbid, producing that kind of content, then you will get, cornered and sidetracked and shadow banned, and the content doesn't get out there. It's a lot more difficult to distribute.
Yes. And that's what worries me about today. I mean, one of the things you said was, well, the information's there for everybody to see. And it was.
Mm-hmm.
right? Before the internet, if you knew where to look, you could go to a library, you could crack open a book by Mises or Hayek, and you could do that sort of thing. And then as the internet exploded, there was this golden age where it was a free for all. Everything was out there, and you
Yeah.
could just find it. But now there are these dark clouds that are coming over the entire internet, where um, everything gets politicized. Everything gets polarized. So people would say, Murray Rothbard was a racist, so now you shouldn't be able to read Murray Rothbard anymore, and
Right.
things like that. It was it, there's a phrase that came from a guy named, is it the same Brandon Smith that you interviewed that does alt dash market?
I don't think
Uh,
so, actually. I think they're two different people.
Oh, okay. But he
Yeah.
talked about negative branding, how like the establishment will brand you negatively before you get a chance to brand yourself. And then
Right.
you're stuck with the negative branding from the establishment. And so now what the establishment is quick to paint you with that brush of whatever racism, extremist, hate-filled, and they'll just tie anything they want to it. I'll go on a really brief rant about
Yeah,
a book
please.
called The Politics of Bitcoin, written by a University of Virginia English professor, David Columbia, who writes that, the right wing extremism is literally coded into the basis of Bitcoin. And
Huh.
I did a review of his book, and I read his review of the book, and I'm like, where does he get to the part where he explains how right-wing extremism is literally coded into Bitcoin? And then I flip the page and the book is ended. That's the end of the book. He never gets there. He just says, it's just any criticism of central banking or Fed policy reserve is just branded with that right-wing brush.
Well,
And then that's the end of it.
this is fascinating to me, Mark, because what you're talking about is actually, I think, a real problem. I mean, people who think like you do and really think like I do, and I wanted to get into this, as I said in school, I studied a lot about the classical liberal tradition. I mean, I spent a lot of time reading, 18th and 19th century political philosophy. And now this stuff is called extremist. And it's like, wait a minute, this is just my point of view, and it's not illogical. And I'm certainly no extremist. I'm not a racist or, you know, but if you even mention, a belief in a free market, which to me is just, being free to choose, having freedom. I mean, these aren't bad ideas, but it's getting branded into this niche of extremism. And suddenly it's like we're all getting thrown into, with the neo-Nazis or something.
Yeah.
It's just
Suddenly
like,
we're
how did
skinheads.
this happen?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's insane. I mean, I don't mind having a political disagreement, and I don't expect the world to suddenly change and have people, jumping up and down for free market reform right now. But it's just bizarre that, a perfectly valid political philosophy is now getting some, and not really by direct attack, but just slowly over time through, this little, well, I mean, what you're talking about in the article, and we can kind of segue into this, is this notion that I would agree with you called toxic virtue. And it is the same, and why I was really attracted to that article, because this is exactly the same as the sort of conflict that was happening between the philosophies behind, say, the American Revolution and the French Revolution.
Right.
They had all these same conversations about virtue. And what's happening now is this same thing, the same conversation, these conflicting notions of virtue, where exactly the same concept of virtue that caused the French terror is now coming to the fore. And people who would say, believing in individual liberty is virtuous, those people are getting branded actually as anti-virtuous, and maybe the first ones lined up for the guillotine that apparently seems to be coming our way, or, is coming through this digital censorship now, is already here.
Right, exactly. I mean, I don't know a lot about the American Revolution. I'm Canadian, so we didn't
Right.
study. I didn't study as much American history, but the differences between, I've always had a bit of a fascination with the French Revolution,
Mhm.
and in my mind, the American Revolution they had those conversations that you're talking about, and they decided to go in the voluntarist direction.
Right.
Whereas the French Revolution, in my mind, the what came after in the wake of the fall of the monarchy was a technocratic impulse. And another book I'm working on now, I posit the Committee on Public Safety, or the Council on Public Safety, that ran the guillotines, as the first technocracy. And
Right.
it was like, we know best. We have a reason-based platform that's one size fits all, and what we decide is virtuous is by definition virtuous, and anyone who doesn't agree with this is by definition illegitimate. And the American Revolution kind of went, nothing gets to happen until all sides agree that this can happen, and then
Right.
and that's the difference between the two impulses.
Well, I think I was actually looking at the poster behind you about technocracy in the 1930s. I've been doing a series of interviews. I interviewed Patrick Wood, who has a technocracy.news, and has been following this. And I've done some interviews. I did an interview recently with Rosa Corey about Agenda 21. And we've been doing a lot of discussion about this technocracy movement recently and the way it's manifesting itself now. But I have been thinking about 1929, just like in your poster right behind you, where it's like, because I'm, of course, I'm getting worried what's going to happen. They seem to be tanking the economy. They're trying to go. The World Economic Forum is now calling it the Great Reset, the Fourth Industrial Revolution. There's obviously these big changes right in line with this technocratic concept coming right around the corner. And then I got to think, well, this happened in 1933, 1929. People get through these things. The system is always trying to take more control. They're always using these same excuses. And I do think it's a great concept to take it all the way back to that French Revolution and this, these conflicts that were going on, these conflicts between these different ideas that were happening during the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century, between people like, well, the difference between John Locke versus Rousseau, which then Rousseau's ideas kind of end up becoming what the French Revolution is. So there's a lot there. And I think you're exactly right. This idea, another thing that I've been playing around with in my mind, and we can touch on this, the two things that are bothering me the most about the way things are going right now is, number one is this idea of virtue. And then number two is this notion that I'm calling, I think people are calling scientism. When I talked to Patrick Wood, we talked about this quite a bit, and it was great to kind of vet that, because scientism is the same. Then you go back to the French Revolution and it's exactly the same. They were using this concept of reason and saying, well, our reason, we've used reason, now we know the truth. If you disagree with us, you're just wrong. Like no concept of humility in that. Like, reason is a tool, science is a good tool, let's use it. But thinking that you've proven something beyond a shadow of a doubt, and then you can impose your beliefs on everybody else, I mean, that's the next step,
Well, my sort of off the cuff response is, there is no such thing as settled science.
Right.
And if anyone says that there is, they're making a theological statement, not a scientific statement. I don't know if you saw, I put out another article after the toxic virtue article about how transhumanism will be the religion of the technocracy.
Right.
And Patrick Woods, I noticed, linked to it from Technocracy News. And that's actually the book that I was working on last year, is called The Singularity Has Been Canceled. And I put it on the back burner to write Unassailable, because I just thought what was happening with cancel culture was so bad I had to write that book. And so now I'm bringing The Singularity Has Been Canceled back on. I'm working on it again now. And it's the whole idea. It's the futility of techno-utopian thinking. All right. And it's the idea that we can succeed at completely managing society is a dangerous idea, not just a wrong idea. And that a lot of the disasters that we kind of bounce from disaster to disaster is the result of this sort of managerial mindset that we can, tweak out all risk and all bad outcomes and all bad consequences.
If only we have enough data.
If only we have enough data.
We can
Yeah,
figure it out.
data is the new God. And
Yeah.
so the sort of subplot that I have in my mind is that there's it's sort of a battle between hyper materialism, like total hardcore reductionists that kind of think that
Mhm.
the mind is just something the brain emits, like, steam from a kettle, and then people who think that there's a non-material aspect to reality that different cultures and different systems have different words for. I personally, I don't identify as a religious person per se, but I believe that um, consciousness precedes materiality, not the other
Right.
way. And so I think that is most of these differences can kind of come down to whether you believe that the brain is a machine or whether you believe that there's, an underlying non-material premise to the universe.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. I've noticed this for a long time, that the political divide and this, I mean, there's obviously some kind of yin yang separation going here, and having that materialistic mindset is definitely a part of what I would call the mythology of scientism. And then people who are, people who tend to be branded conspiracy theorists, or aren't going along with the big pharma models of healthcare, are more holistic and more energetic based, and have a tendency to be more open-minded to other cultures and other cultures' mindsets. And then it's so ironic too, because these materialists who want to have control over the economy and think they can apply this materialist science to economy or culture or social engineering, um, they then say they believe in diversity, and they attack the other side for not
Right.
being diverse, when I feel like I'm like, I study Tai Chi, right? I
Yeah.
have indigenous friends, and I pay attention to their spiritual path, and I'm open-minded to learning about. I mean, I don't understand, how am I a racist?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yet it's these people who are the materialists are the ones who, to me, the whole thing about diversity actually kind of boggles my mind, because it sounds more like a nice way of putting assimilation.
Right.
Oh, we want to get all people into our way because our way is obviously superior. And if you disagree with us, then, you're a racist and you don't believe in diversity. It's like, wait a minute, aren't you projecting onto me what you're trying, your supremacist belief that your system is superior? Yeah. It's just mind boggling. And then if you speak like this, of course, again, who knows? I mean, we may have already triggered the YouTube algorithms on this
It's
one.
possible. It's possible. Yeah, diversity is our strength, but what, you eat organic food? What are you, a nutcase? You can't do
Yeah.
that. So,
Yeah. Well, let's kind of get back into this idea of virtue, and then how it's being used to justify censorship. I think, when it comes to these bigger social media outlets, like, what are you seeing in that, if you don't follow these certain prescribed notions about what virtue is, then what are these tools that they're using against content providers?
right. Well, I have to, and this is kind of to the point. I have to proceed what I'm about to say with, I'm not a Trump supporter. Okay.
Right.
I'm a Canadian. So,
Yeah.
but even ideologically, I had to just kind of like toe the libertarian line and root for Gary Johnson in the last election down there. And that was a tough nut to swallow. I'm
Yeah.
happier
Yeah.
with who the LPC picked this year, Joe Jorgensen. So I'm kind of like, finally someone we can get behind. But anyhow, I'm not a Trump supporter. I even did the audiobook version of Stockman's Peak Trump book. So, and I have a long podcast with David A. Stockman talking about everything Trump's done wrong on this
Yeah.
term. But to your point, the idea that not thinking Trump is the Antichrist is by definition a polarizing opinion, right?
Right.
So you'll read it in the New York Times, or you'll hear it on CNN. You'll hear like this pro-Trump cartoonist, and it's like a slur. It's like a pejorative comment to to have voted Trump, to be pro-Trump, to and from there to even be conservative. So it's sort of almost like ipso facto. Of course, this person is intransigent and subhuman and immoral because they have these pro-Trump leanings. And even before the election was over, I wrote an article called "The Cultural Purge Will Not Be Televised," and I thought Hillary was going to win, like everybody thought. And I thought
Right.
there's going to be a cultural purge after the election, not against people who were pro-Trump, but it's even going to include people who were not anti-Trump enough. And so it starts there. That's sort of that election was the rupture in the matrix that I don't know is ever going to be repaired. And that was such an upset that if you put any other opinion forward other than the Kremlin installed Trump and hacked the election, you are by definition an immoral person. You're a white supremacist, or you're alt-right adjacent, or you're
Right.
something. And then from there, it's like virtue starts there. And everything on this side of the line is on the side of the angels, and anything remotely to the right of that line is by definition not virtuous. And it's like you said, you're not even allowed to have a difference of opinion. You're not even allowed to say, here's like, as I wrote in that article, all differences of opinions, all disagreements are really different priorities,
Right.
right?
That's
You have a
right.
different setup. You prioritize something differently from me. That's where we're going to get
And
a disagreement over.
And that's why it's so important that it's an individual choice. We all prioritize
Yes.
things differently in our lives. And if you start saying, no, no, this is what's best for the community. And if you don't prioritize this, then you're like you're talking about, then you're the Antichrist or you're some kind of a Nazi.
Yeah.
I mean, aren't you walking a pretty dangerous line there? Who's the real Nazi in this situation?
Right. Yeah. I mean, and even before it was so polarized, before 2016, the housing bubble, right? It was decided, almost from on high, owning a house is beneficial to all Americans. But in a lot of cases, owning a house is not beneficial, especially if your debt load is too high to own a house.
Right.
It's going to it's going to cause stress. It's going to be pressure. Number one cause of marriage breakup is financial stress. So only an individual person could decide for themselves if home ownership is beneficial for them or not. But then, you know, government knows best stepped in, and policymakers, and they said, no, 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 leave this to us. We've got this. Home ownership is great. You're going to love it. They blew up this housing bubble, and of course it imploded. And then on the other end of it, it's like, whoa, who knew? How could we have forecasted this? It was just one, it was just one of these things.
Well, don't you get tired of the libertarians, the Austrians, always being right about these things, telling them over and over again, and then when it actually happens, they don't go, "God, how did you guys know?"
No,
Yeah,
they say, oh, the free market let us down
yeah,
again.
yeah.
We got to rethink this capitalism.
Right, definitely. Got to give more power to the technocrats. Get more
Yeah.
big data so we can figure out why the free market has failed us.
Yes. Yeah. It's exasperating. I mean, it's so frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah, and we can't, like kind of like what you're talking about, the way that, I mean, I don't know, you probably heard this concept of the Overton window where we're allowed to
Yes.
speak within these parameters. And like, I think, I mean, if you are a libertarian or going as far as an anarcho-capitalist or just even, having a belief in a free market, I mean, one of the things I try to do, I'm trying to break apart this left-right paradigm and saying, you know what, in a free market, nobody's stopping you from starting a cooperative or a collective or living in a
Mm-hmm.
community, of your own volition, any way that you want. There's no conflict here. Why are we arguing about this? We just have to know that freedom is better than, centralized control by a handful of people. And that all of these other, you talk about these utopias, these are just excuses by a controlling class or a smaller group of people who's saying, oh, we know what's better for you. If we have control over this, I mean, let's talk about, I guess, one of the things that you say just on the homepage when you're describing Out of the Cave, the blog, is that the real conflict is about centralization versus decentralization. And I think this is where we're
Yeah.
going. I've definitely thought about that too. I'm tired of having ideological conversations. Can we just recognize that the more power is centralized, the more somebody's going to take advantage of that, right? So the more these people, whoever is on top of the pyramid at that point, is going to be taking advantage of this.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I do another podcast called Axis of Easy with Charles Hugh Smith, who you might have heard of, and Jesse Hirsch, who's another Canadian like me. And that is we always come back to that point of decentralization is the next sort of configuration if humanity chooses it. And I just started re-listening to a book that had a huge impact on me 20 or 30 years ago called The Sovereign Individual. I don't know if you've read that one, but it was two guys, James Dale Davidson, who's still around, and he put out another book called The Breaking Point, which is pretty good as well. And Lord Rees-Mogg, who I think has passed away. Their whole idea is that what we are going through now are the death throes of the nation state. And I always say, or I've been saying lately, and I tell my daughter this all the time, the most important thing you can do is study history. And she just kind of rolls her eyes and goes back to TikTok. But hopefully eventually she's going to, if I hit her with this enough times, because you study history, you realize that the configuration of power has changed. And you could even make the argument that has gotten more egalitarian as it has changed. I mean, we've come a long way from when we all belonged to the church and the king, right? So we have made progress. But now we're going through another change, and the outgoing power configuration is going to make they're going to make a last stand to try and keep the configuration their way. And it's the difference between the centralization and decentralization. It's the difference between the nation state and what comes after the nation state. So Sovereign Individual, they said, when the Soviet Empire fell, it was not a final victory of capitalism over communism. What it really was a pair of sclerotic twins, and the one twin died, and the other a few decades ahead of the other twin. And the other twin was the American rules-based international order, which would eventually die too. And I think we have entered that phase of history. And so what comes after that phase, there could be this head fake towards more totalitarianism and more top-down control as a last gasp, and it may even succeed for a while. But I think the long-range trajectory of history is toward this decentralization, and the big indicator of that has been Bitcoin and the success of cryptocurrencies and decentralized technologies. Because, again, another thing that I always talk about a lot, and I didn't invent this concept by any stretch, but whoever controls the monetary system controls society. And so cryptocurrencies were basically taking that control away, or the potential to take that control away from the central banks.
Well, it's interesting that you're bringing this up. We're having this discussion because I do think that we're getting to a place where humanity is actually going to have to really make a choice, because if whoever they are, what you call the globalists, these people that seem to be, on top of the corporate hierarchy, they also want to break down the nation state. They don't want to have different regulations in the United States and Mexico and Japan. So they're looking, and they want to take down this nation state concept and then replace it with a world state concept with, and that's when you get into the whole, one world government and new world order kind of ideas. But it is interesting to me because I think that in the breakdown of the concept of the nation state, which I think you're right is happening, we have an opportunity, the people have an opportunity to insert themselves at that point and say, no, we're demanding decentralization now. Now that if we're going to make a shift, instead of more centralization on this world scale, let's make the shift towards decentralization. And so it's actually, it's going to be interesting times, and we'll see who comes out on top. I hope it's true that that through conversations like this, honestly, we can build momentum throughout society to promote this decentralization idea.
Where I would maybe take a bit of a different tack is that the whole one world government thing, I think, is a vestige of the nation state mindset. And I think we can all kind of breathe a little easier on that, because I think that ship has sailed and it's never coming in. I think that's a mindset of, last generation nation states, the power mongers who want to control them all. But I don't think it's going to happen. I think there could be a realization dawning that it's never going to happen. But one of the things we ruminate a lot about on Axis of Easy is, yes, the nation state is on its way out, but it's really going to suck if what replaces the nation state is Facebook and Google, right? That's going to be even worse. So what we think about a lot is the battle, the next level battle is going to be between what we call platforms and protocols, right? So you have decentralized protocols that are typically open sourced and everyone can read the source code, and you can get a lot done on these open source protocols, and everyone can join in and take part and use it to make ad hoc projects. And then you have the platform, which is closed source. It's a black box. You don't know what's in it. You don't know how the algos work. And I think so that's the defining kind of battle going forward. Once the nation states are kind of post-relevant, it will be, what are the power configurations that are embracing open source protocol standards, and we want to align with that.
Right.
And what are, or it's, I'm a citizen of Facebook, or Neil Stephenson's snow crash, basically.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's an interesting idea, that these large technocratic corporations could just take over the function of the nation state and be even more controlling than a nation state ever could, because they're controlling all of the data.
Well, think about it. So when Libra was announced by Facebook, right? I mean, it was blindingly fast how quickly nation states and their spokespeople came out and attacked it. And it was, I mean, setting aside a little bit of cognitive dissonance right now on my part to say, because it might even sound like I'm defending Facebook, but the U.S., it was the State Department or the Senate, they sent out letters to members of the Libra consortium saying, you should drop out of the consortium or we're going to investigate you for child pornography and other crimes.
Oh, wow.
Right? It was literally an extortion letter. And we put out a weekly, on easyDNS, we put out like a weekly tech digest called Axis of Easy, and we reported on that. I can't remember which one it was. So the nation state attack on Facebook's Libra was quick, and it was extreme. And why is that? Well, think about it. If you are using Facebook's Libra currency and earning your money in Libra, suddenly you can envision a period, an age not too far away, where your Facebook login is more relevant to your day-to-day existence than your nation state issued passport.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if these corporations aren't dependent on the nation state currency to transact business, then yeah, why do they need the nation state anymore?
Exactly. And so, but again, I don't want to jump from being a U.S. or a Canadian citizen to being a Facebook citizen. I think that would be less than a lateral move.
Right. I guess where I've been going lately in observing all of this and this big transition and what's happening with the coronavirus and the lockdowns and the economic shift that's happening with all of this is, even though things are changing and we're getting away from this nation state model, I definitely agree with that. But, these central bankers that have now amassed just hundreds of billions of dollars that can control trillions of dollars, they're not going to go away. They must have a plan for what the transition, where we're transitioning to, and that plan's going to benefit them, right? If we continue to allow them to exert the kind of control that they have.
So I struggle with this a lot. And so you've probably heard the phrase, don't ascribe to conspiracy what can be explained by stupidity, right?
Sure.
So for me, I constantly struggle with, is there this conspiratorial cabal that's like trying to run society in this direction, or is it just a bunch of bumbling idiots bouncing off of each other, trying to like keep the train on the tracks?
Yeah.
And some days I believe the former, but more days I believe the latter, and I do most of my thinking from that latter assumption that there is no big vast conspiracy at the top of people sitting around a table in robes and a pentagram. It's just a bunch of like inept bureaucrats trying to keep the system the same and
Right.
lining their own pockets at every possible opportunity. And so if we can't keep the system on the rails, we can at least loot enough out of it to support our grandchildren's children, then that's plan B. And when I think about it, it's like, and the reason I think about it that way, because I have known people around the periphery of government and law enforcement, and I talk to them about it, and it's like, Mark, you have no idea how stupid these people are.
Right.
Like
Sure.
career politicians and bureaucrats, it's like, I don't know where we get these people from, and you know, but they end up in politics. And one of the greatest lines from that Sovereign Individual book is that too little attention has been paid to the fact that electoral politics lures disordered messianic personalities into positions of power.
Mm-hmm.
Best quote ever. And so you have this paradoxical construct where you have this sort of contraption that exerts a lot of influence in the world, that attracts the most incompetent people of society into it, because people who are smart enough to actually run a country are too smart to get into politics. So you
Right.
kind of end up with these kind of like second string half-wits running government and just having their strings pulled by self-serving people behind the scenes that are just really trying to keep a sweet deal going, and
Sure.
whatever they can do to keep it on the rails. That's kind of what I believe. Sometimes it gets really hard to believe that, though.
I
Right?
well,
Sometimes it's like, oh my God.
the flip side of that is, um, there's no such thing as a coincidence. If you start seeing where things are lining up, because I go back and forth just like you do, I think a lot of us do. But when, well, this is interesting. We have this fact here and this thing over here and this thing over here. And because they all happened, then suddenly, this plan was able to get enacted. I mean, I think, the lockdown or what, if the coronavirus came out and it all worked out, and then now we were able to impose these lockdowns and whatever. I mean, if you look at them as coincidences, then sure, there's just this huge bureaucracy here that's just kind of sluggishly moving sort of stupidly through. Is there, are a billionaire cabal behind the whole thing that produced those coincidences in order to motivate the bureaucracy? I don't know. I think unfortunately, maybe I have a tendency to go in that direction, because I think you don't amass billions of dollars unless you have it together in some way. It's not the bureaucracy that I'm worried about, right? It's the actual guys that own the banks, that own the central, that run the central banking system. That just, it concerns me that they do have a longer term view. You go on the World Economic Forum website and you can see that they've tracked out, all of these things, this fourth industrial revolution that they want to produce. And then all of a sudden the media is starting to push everyone in this direction. And it's kind of like, God, I don't know. I wish I could be more optimistic about the bumbling nature of the thing. But to me, the vast bureaucracy of it actually is it's just wasted labor for the benefit of these few very wealthy individuals that seem to be getting most of the benefit from the way things evolve.
I mean, I believe that there is what we loosely call a deep state of just there's this kind of infrastructure around the ceremonial positions of power that kind of are the ones that kind of move policies down the track.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it is, and again, I struggle with it a lot. I mean, when you said the lockdowns, the image that rolled through my brain was a contagion of incompetence just kind of swept the world, right?
Sure.
And hysteria and incompetence is contagious. But when you
Right.
look at, you look at things like media bias. I mean, media is just undeniably biased. That it and even academia is biased. And I think about, the Fabian socialists. It's like, well, they kind of have proved victorious over the years,
Right.
um, but I don't regard them as. I mean, I don't. I guess I find it hard to wrap my head around a world-encompassing conspiracy, and I find it easier to believe in sort of interscene competing factions of pet conspiracies, some of which achieve critical velocity more than others.
Right. Well, I mean, I do hope that you're right. I think I just over the years have started to lean more in the one direction than the other, because I do think these, you can
Well,
see where handfuls of wealthy individuals do collude through certain organizations, and then the ideas that they present, tend to manifest over time. So,
but even if I'm right, doesn't make the situation we're heading into any less dangerous, because
right.
incompetence can do even more damage than
Sure.
than the
Sure.
conspiracy, right? So,
Well, and there's no doubt that the masses of people are tending to jump on the bandwagon with this, especially, with the virtue signaling that you're talking, that we're kind of prefacing this conversation on. I mean, it's just so easy. I mean, everybody wants to be a good person. And when you're given a choice, and, and the media bias is coming through, and everybody's shouting at you that, hey, wearing a mask is saving your fellow man, and then if you're not, I mean, here's something I wanted to bring up with you just along the same topic. Like, I had a local, one of my county board of supervisors posted a article that's been making the rounds lately. If you don't want to wear a mask, then you're probably a psychopath.
I think I saw that. I
Yeah,
think I saw that. Yeah.
you lack empathy for your fellow man. You're a psychopathic human being. And, we need as a community to be very, very wary of these people, which is, of course, the next step is, if you disagree with the dominant narrative, well, you need to be committed, into the asylums for you.
That even happened way before any of this. Like, I'm talking 2005, 2006. It was during the Bush era,
Mm-hmm.
right? When I think they put like a conspiratorial mindset and being anti-authority got put into the DSM,
Yep. Right.
right?
Right.
And so now in those days, this is one of the reasons why I sort of think that it's mini conspiracies or mini current, conflicting tectonic shifts, is because the media bias during the neocon age, like during the Bush era, post 9/11, was completely conservative and right wing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the word liberal was practically a slur in those
Right.
days.
Right.
Now it's completely the other way around. And I think so, I think maybe it is pendulumatic, maybe it is an ebb and flow. And but people, again, it brings me back to history. People don't study history, so people think that the way it is now is just the way it's always been, and it's just the future is just going to be this linear extrapolation of where we are now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think people don't, I mean, as someone who, I mean, I've read history and studied history in school. And the way that I learned how to study it, actually, and I had a good teacher, sometimes it just takes one person to kind of make a difference. But, he was very clear that, look, history is something that is interpreted. And I
Yeah.
did a lot of paper writing, doing comparing and contrasting different historians. Why did they take these facts and then make this narrative out of these facts? And so you learn that there's a certain subjectivity about it, but there's also a lot of information, and there's a lot of different points of view, and it deserves serious study. And people don't take the time. And I would argue the government run schools, of course, produce a type of history that most people think is just what really happened, without any appreciation that this is something that has been, this isn't the truth. This isn't set in stone. This is somebody's opinion, first of all. And second of all, you're being educated by the government. It's probably a pro-government version of history, It's not really pro-individualist. So I think people really, and because then they don't focus a lot on history, a lot of people think it's boring. They don't get into it, but everybody has a historiosity in their mind, a belief as to what happened in the past. And this really, this affects the choices that you make in the present moment. So it's a lot more important than people realize, I think.
I'm pretty sensitive to it because just my family background, I grew up in a household where my parents were like almost a full, there's a missing generation. Like they were old enough to be my grandparents. They had
That's
their
interesting.
kids.
I was the same way, actually. It does give you a different perspective on things.
And my mom grew up in Nazi Germany.
Oh, wow.
She was born in 1930. So she was, she was a child. She was, she had to join the Hitler Youth. She got kicked out of the Hitler Youth towards the end of the war. And she, loved telling that story.
Yeah.
My dad flew a Spitfire. So he was in the RAF.
Oh,
right.
No
and,
kidding.
so a microcosm of this sort of historical dynamic in our house is my mom. One day during dinner, my mom is telling the story about they had to, instead of go to school, they had to go out into the potato fields and pick the bugs off the potato fields, and it was never ending. And they thought at the end of this hill, we'll be done. And they get to the top of the hill and there's just rows and rows and rows of more potatoes. And my dad just burst out laughing. And she's like, "What's so funny?" I said, "Oh, I remember flying over those fields and dropping the bugs on your potatoes," right? They're just kind of glaring at each other across the table. And so I always had this understanding that, history, there was multiple narratives throughout history.
Yeah.
My mom was always, she died last year, but towards the end, she was trying to write down everything she knew about how the history behind the origin of World War I was completely different than how people understood it.
Sure.
Right. And I gave her a couple of books. I can't remember who wrote them, but just this sort of like, it wasn't so one-sided. And she's like, "Thank you so much for giving me these books. I thought I was insane." But she understood that World War II was a direct consequence of World War I, and the Germans basically get blamed for both, but that World War I had its own set of unique tectonic currents that were intersecting with each other, and the British were not blameless, and it took two to tango for that whole thing to happen. I feel like the world is a lot like that today too, actually, that we're kind of like stumbling around this geopolitical powder keg, and there's not a lot of awareness around it.
Well, I'll tell you, here in the United States, I mean, it's really difficult for people to think of the United States government as doing something wrong, morally wrong. Even if they're really progressive people, they know that war is bad. I don't think they take it to the level of like the U.S. government produces propaganda, the anti-Syria propaganda, or what's going on in the Middle East. Like they're not looking at a U.S. foreign policy as nearly, I just think it's a disaster. I think the United States is a literal, pox on the rest of the world, basically, when it comes to their foreign policy. They're killing people all over the place, left and right, just to make money. It's there's no justification when they try to demonize one country. Their excuses are just weak excuses to go in and kill people and drop bombs and take resources. And it's just like, my God, why don't the rest of the Americans stand up against this and say, stop, this is horrible. But I don't know, you don't want to project on yourself how bad, you maybe you really are, I guess.
Well, I don't mean to keep talking up my own articles, but I just put up an article today on Out of the Cave called "Let's Talk About Privilege." And the whole point of it is the most divisive or toxic privilege in the world today is the privilege of being able to print the world reserve currency from nothing. Right. And enforce a global order based on that currency. And so that's what we're talking about, that the U.S. is an empire militarily occupies hundreds of countries, over 100 countries in the world, and it enforces, like, whoever prints the currency controls society, and the US prints the world reserve currency, and it prints it out of nothing. That was the big change that took place in 1972.
Yeah.
And so that whole toxic foreign policy, that it's part of that monetary policy. And so it comes back to the big phrase that you just said. It's very difficult because this policy enables a standard of living in the US that's light years ahead of what it should be if it was
Sure.
just normal
Based on
economic
productivity.
competition.
Yeah.
So it's basically impossible to get somebody to understand something if their livelihood depends on them not understanding it. The famous
Right.
Upton St. Clair quote, right?
Right. Well, on this line, did you ever see the letter, the email that was sent from the French president to Hillary Clinton right before the Libya attack, where
No,
this was fascinating to me because I had never thought about this, especially considering that France is now using the euro, part of the European Union. Well, it turns out that in North Africa, most of the money in circulation is still the French franc.
really.
And when Gaddafi was talking about like going off of the, using his gold that he'd accumulated with the Libyan oil to start a Pan-African currency based on a gold standard, based on the gold that he had. And the French were concerned that this is the, basically the last vestige of the French Empire because they still control the currency in North Africa. And he's
Yep.
writing Clinton a letter saying, we got to take this guy out. He's taking out the French franc. And it was like, my God, it still functions this way, even after France itself isn't even using the franc anymore. But they're still
Yeah.
using that currency to control their former empire, just like the US uses the dollar to control the rest of the world. I mean, it's amazing. I wish people understood these kind of macroeconomic principles a lot
There's
better, because then world politics starts to become a lot more understandable.
Well, there's a great book by a guy named Steven Zarlinga, and I've mentioned this several times in the past 2 days, actually, who wrote the book The Lost Science of Money. And he passed away a couple years ago as well, but he was the one who articulated the best that who controls the money society controls the society, but he enumerated it over history, all of these different examples of it throughout history. He actually was behind, it was a Democrat senator, believe it or not, who introduced a monetary reform bill in the US a few years ago that Zarlinga architected.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as libertarians, we wouldn't have been fans of it because it called for government printed money out of nothing. But what he was trying to do, his whole point was, we don't need the Federal Reserve. We
Right.
should, as a government, be printing money internally from the Treasury Department, and we're basically, yeah. So there
I've
was
done
all
a
that,
few
but
I've done a few interviews with Ellen Brown in the past of the Public Banking Institute, and I do think it's a better option than, I mean, why are we paying interest to a private company when at
well,
least we can just print it ourselves? I mean,
my understanding, though, is that the interest gets remitted back to Treasury every year by the Fed. I've read that in a few different places, but that actually doesn't diminish the point that it's still, I think, a completely wrong way to do it, because but if you bring it in house and you do it, I don't think there's a government on the planet that can resist the temptation to overprint.
of
You
course,
basically,
sure.
but we're headed for modern monetary theory anyway. We're headed for UBI.
I mean,
We're headed for MMT. I mean, that's just the way it's
right.
going to go.
Yeah, I know it's conflicting. I mean, I've even, like, I've done, I don't know, in political activism here in Northern California, where, the predominant view is so progressive, I've tried to find ways. Then the public banking is one of them. There's a movement, I don't know if you've heard of, called the Community Rights Movement here in Mendocino, which is just trying to decentralize, and it's I mean, it's in the United States. But they're just trying to give communities the right to legislate without state and federal preemption, so local communities can have more power. And to me, anything that decentralizes, anything that can take a local economy off of the tit of state and federal dependence, or
Yeah.
Wall Street dependence, which is what if we had a local public bank, for example, a county public bank, then our pension funds could be invested in that. That gets invested locally, rather than going to Wall Street and then getting invested in whatever, and then and then we're borrowing more money from the big banks, the Federal Reserve banks.
Well, Charles Hugh Smith, who writes from a blog called Of Two Minds, and we do the podcast together. He's envisioned this idea for like a community locally issued currency that would be based on actual productive work, goods and services produced within the community. So
Right.
it takes it brings the currency, the power of the currency back down to the local community itself. And he wrote it up in a book called A Radically Beneficial World. That's how I met him. It was the first audio book I ever did. And so he talks all about it in that, and we revisit that from time to time in the podcasts. And it's, I think it's all of this is the same impulse, right? It's all of the same thing, that it's like everybody should be able to decide whatever they want to decide and be able to do it where those decisions have the most impact, like in their local communities.
Well, great, Mark. I think maybe that's a good place to wrap it up. We've covered a lot of ground, but we definitely, kind of came to a bit of a conclusion there. Is there anything else that you want to talk about? We've been going on for a while, but and you can also tell people where they can find out more about your work, and do a little plug for easyDNS.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you're looking for a domain name, DNS, web hosting, email, easydns.com is the way to go. I can, if you want, I can create a coupon code for you. What's the name of the podcasting? It's The Shift, right?
Yeah, The Shift. The Shift with Doug McKenty.
Yeah, let's do The Shift as a coupon code. We'll get you half off your first purchase. I'll get that set up. And then our weekly newsletter and podcast goes out from accessofeasy.com. And then my personal blog, where I sort of write about all the other stuff, is outofthecave.io. And to get the book for free, there's it's on the missing manual for protecting your freedom or something like that is on the Access of Easy site. When I actually go to unassailable.book.com, will take you to a page that gets you to the free ebook.
Yep, and I highly recommend this book for anybody, especially if you're a content creator. It's it just provides a blueprint, very practical guide for how to get your stuff out there, but not become dependent on these larger platforms, and keep control of your own content and monetizing your own stuff, so that you are in control of your customers and not allowing Twitter and Facebook and YouTube to be in control for you. I learned a lot. I'm going to have to start applying some of that advice myself. I can tell you that.
I got to admit, we still put our full episodes up on YouTube for Access of Easy. And I'm like, I every time I upload one, I'm like, I wrote in my book not to do what I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
But I do it anyway. I'm like, oh, I'm not being that controversial. It'll be fine. But
the web. Well, just to say, from my point of view, when you are a content creator, it actually is kind of, it's good to set up a system from the get-go that functions really well, because the web design stuff and the web hosting stuff is a lot of time, and I'm not I'm not a tech person, so it's a huge learning curve that I have to go through every time I want to change something around. So
yeah.
It's great to, again, recommend the book for people, especially if you're just getting started, because once you set up the system, then it's easy to maintain. But if you set it up in a way that where YouTube is your source for monetization, and all of a sudden you say the wrong thing, well, so anyway, Mark, great. I will tell people that they can go to www.theshiftnow.com actually, and think about subscribing. to my podcast so you can get the full podcast. I am putting out just half of each podcast onto these major platforms and trying to get people back, but I do need to work on making a better email list and staying more in touch with those people who do subscribe. So I'll add that to the list as I'm trying to get more content. I'm also on Twitter at DMcKenty, on Facebook and YouTube at The Shift with Doug McKenty. So thanks for being on the show, Mark, and that was a great conversation. I hope people are listening, and I hope we can get more of these ideas out there because, it's important. Maybe we can convince people to decentralize before the collapse.
Yeah, that would be good.
All right, well, have a good one. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. All right.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I thought that was a great show. Really appreciate Mark Jeftovic for being on the program. I think you should check out that book, Unassailable, especially if you are thinking about becoming a content creator, or if you are creating your own content and trying to post it or distribute it over these third-party platforms. He's got a lot of great advice and really technical, specific advice how to build your website so that you cannot be taken out by this modern day censorship. I think that this issue of this virtue mongering and this, taking people out because of their alternative beliefs, it's becoming more and more serious. It's something I'm really concerned about, not just in terms of being a content creator myself, but in terms of having a real legitimate political dialogue in this day and age. A lot of particular points of view are being taken off the table. You're afraid that you might get called names, might get pegged as a racist if you don't follow the particular narrative. Just all kinds of. I don't even. I don't even know what to say. It's frustrating for me. I feel like a lot of times I have to self-censor or be very careful about the kind of words that I use and the way that I describe my arguments when I'm making political arguments out in public, because if I put something the wrong way, it will be misconstrued. I think there's a real problem with this type of virtue that is especially founded on what I'm calling scientism. Didn't really get into this with Mark, but I just recently had a conversation with Patrick Wood on our 7th roundtable discussion about scientism and the way there's almost this mythology that sort of claims to use science, that claims that science has discovered some kind of a truth that if you don't follow, then you're simply just wrong. It doesn't take into account that there are other scientists with other points of views, that scientists are people just like everyone else, and there are lots of scientists with lots of different perspectives out there, and that freedom of speech is important in science just as it is in politics. But unfortunately, people can latch on to a quote-unquote scientific consensus, which may or may not be the case, but can be promoted as such. And if you disagree with them, then you're wrong. And there's some sort of virtue attached to following the science that says this is what's best for the community. If you don't follow this science, then you're hurting the community, that you don't care about the community. I've seen articles out now saying if you don't want to wear a mask, you must be a psychopath. We're going down the same road people went down in the Soviet Union, the same road that people went down in Nazi Germany. If you're not following the party line, you're just a bad person. Maybe you're a crazy person that needs to get committed. If you're not following the state corporate narrative, then your point of view is wrong. You're peddling fake news. You need to be censored. The same exact kind of road that was traveled in the early days of the French Revolution that led to the terror, exactly like Mark was discussing. So this conversation was really important. He provides in his book Unassailable very practical ways to get around the censorship, to take control over your own message, and to not have to be so affected by what the corporate or government narratives are. You can say what you feel, and people can come to your website and they can participate in your conversation on your website that you control. So having said that, I want to thank everybody for listening. I thought it was, again, a great conversation. If you like what you're hearing and you're not listening to this on the full-length version on the website, then please think about becoming a subscriber. You can go to www.theshiftnow.com And just click on the subscribe button. It's $6 a month. You get the full feature length and participation in the forum. I'm hoping that forum's going to really become a thriving community that I can participate in on a daily basis, and we can really start to work together to build this program and figure out the direction we want to go in. If you have people that you'd like for me to interview, then become a subscriber, hit the forum, let me know, and I'll start looking into talking to the people that you guys want to hear me talk to, so we can just continue to build our knowledge base and go where the show takes us. But I also want to bring up that Mark did offer that coupon at easyDNS.com. If you need somebody to register a domain name with, or you're looking for a good place to host your website, then please check it out. Coupon code The Shift, and you get 50% off your first purchases. So you can get yourself set up on a new website hosting site for a really good deal, and you'll be supporting a great guy and a good cause who believes in keeping you and your ideas protected from these big third-party platforms. So think about doing that. Help him out a little bit. And I wanted to take just a second to apologize for not getting a heck of a lot of content out this month. I have been working on the roundtable discussions with TruthStream Media. So I'll be posting a few. I have a few of those I can post up. And I've just had a couple of scheduling issues. Hopefully I'll be able to catch up in July and do a few extras. So thanks a lot for your patience, and I will be pumping out more content here in the near future. I got one coming up at the end of this week, so that'll be out early next week. And then a few more tentatively scheduled past that. Hopefully those will come through. But I am starting to get more on a roll here, and I'll be getting that content out on a more regular basis in the future. So thanks a lot for your patience, and thank you all so much for listening. I really appreciate it. We'll see you again next time. Thanks a lot. Take care.